people wander in. Anybody have any questions from last week, the material we covered? No, everything's pretty clear? Okay. Good.
That usually means with no questions, everybody knows everything or nothing.
Or they're completely apathetic and don't care. That's the other alternative, which I won't embrace. Yeah, you're here. That shows that you're not apathetic. You're here.
So when I teach, I usually use that as an opportunity to give a quiz.
That's right. If there's silence, okay.
If there's no
if there's silence,
then okay. Put your books away. We're going to have a quiz.
That's a good idea. I've never thought of that. That's a good way to prompt discussion, isn't it?
Either that or it's a good way to.
Okay, let's go ahead and get started here. So this is, he's looking this week at what happens when Christianity becomes the official religion of the Roman world and how it changes. And he does a really good job talking about that. Again, this is Brother Luke Timothy Johnson, LTJ as his friends call him. He's down at Emory University. Let's get him going here. And I'll just let him talk.
By which the Roman Empire turned from a persecutor of the Christian religion to its protector and patron. The personal religious convictions of the imperial patron, Constantine, were never entirely clear. Constantine's personal outlook seemed to combine elements of superstition and syncretism with Christianity. He was baptized, as we saw, as a Christian only at the last possible moment on his deathbed. Certainly, the morality of his politics left much to be desired. He was as ruthless, indeed murderous, in pursuit of his ambitions as any other despot. Yet he seemed genuinely devoted to the cause of the Christian religion, and his mother, Helena, was profoundly devout. In the Eastern Church, both Constantine and Helena are regarded as saints. In the Western Church, Constantine has to get along by merely being designated as the Great. More significant, though, than his personal dispositions are the political actions he took to secure the social and political peace of the empire through his sponsorship of the once despised superstition. According to his biographer Eusebius, Constantine himself wanted to forsake all the temples of deceit, and he wanted everybody else to forsake the temples of deceit and to enter the radiant house of truth. But in fact, Constantine himself remarkably continued a policy of religious freedom for all, including freedom of public observance. This was the case especially in rural areas, which were always slow to change and very slow to convert to Christianity. The very term pagani, from which we get the word pagan, means literally people who dwell in the countryside. Thus, Constantine maintained the title of Pontifex Maximus, the great bridge builder, which was the chief priesthood office held by Roman emperors. And he continued to issue some coins with polytheistic images. This was a gesture of toleration for people who were not Christian. What about with respect to Jews? The policy of earlier emperors who had been stung by the Jewish revolts of the 2nd century, the revolt in Cyrene in 117, and then the momentarily successful Bar Kokhba revolt in 132-135, led them to allow freedom of association among Jews, but to forbid proselytism or any conversion of Gentiles. In other words, Judaism was going to have to remain faithful simply as a kinship group and not take in Gentile converts. Constantine maintains this position. Under him, Jews had the freedom to worship, and their leaders, the rabbis, were exempt from public service, which would have involved them in idolatry. But he even more stringently forbade conversions to Judaism by Gentiles. As head of state, Constantine's greatest religious innovation was the significant patronage he showed to the Christian religion. The privileges of the old state religion began to be transferred. In 313, as we saw, Christian clergy in Africa are granted exemption from military service and other public obligations. In the year 321, Sunday is made a public holiday, and Christian images increasingly appear on coins and on military shields and banners. Perhaps most impressively, Constantine pays for the copying and the production of 50 magnificently bound manuscripts of the entire Bible, the Old Testament in Greek and the New Testament. Two of these beautifully crafted books, called the Codex Vaticanus and the Codex Sinaiticus, are extant and are among the most important textual witnesses to the New Testament. Constantine also, as we saw in the last presentation, began to dedicate formerly pagan temples, such as the Pantheon in Rome, to the use of Christian worship, and to construct new basilicas, such as the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the burial place of Jesus in Jerusalem. They are constructed at imperial command and imperial expense. The public treasury is paying for the Christian churches. And for members of the state apparatus, that great bureaucracy that Diocletian had established, it now becomes obviously advantageous to make a public commitment to Christianity as a factor in career advancement. Now, Constantine referred to himself in humble terms as the servant of God. But he exhibited oversight of the church in the same manner that the pagan emperors had exercised oversight over the polytheistic cults. Constantine termed himself Bishop of External Affairs. His was a difficult balancing act, for as Pontifex Maximus, emperors like Augustus were able to exercise direct control over every aspect of Roman religion. Constantine did not have nearly that same control with respect to Christianity. He quickly discovered that these bishops, whose organization he so much admired, could prove to be deeply resistant to imperial directions. The imperial favor did not mean that the empire became immediately, or certainly not totally, Christian. Great populations of over 60 million people, with a 1,000-year tradition of religious observance, a tradition in fact shared even outside of the empire, do not swivel totally at a single emperor's desire. Many places and many individuals kept the ideals and practices of polytheism alive. As already mentioned, rural areas were particularly slow to convert to Christianity. But equally, intellectuals did not capitulate easily. The famous rhetorician Libanius, whose dates are 314 to 394, who was a highly sophisticated and learned scholar, continued to defend traditional ways, even as he gladly included Christians among his students. Among his orations is a lamentation that he wrote in response to the destruction of pagan temples by the Emperor Theodosius, which I will discuss in a moment. And when his student, the Emperor Julian, was killed, Libanius composed a magnificent eulogy. Indeed, as late as the 5th century, Augustine was required to write an apology called the City of God between the years 416 and 422 against pagan critics who claimed that the reason why the city of Rome had fallen to the barbarians was due to its abandonment of the pagan gods. The efforts of Constantine's successors to impose Christianity on the populace indicate that the transition was neither natural nor was it easy. In 341, Constantius prohibits all pagan sacrifice. Notice that implication is that it clearly continued to be practiced if a prohibition was necessary. But then in 346, Constantius and Constans, whose ruling dates are 337 to 350, issue an edict forbidding sacrifices, and they close temples. A Sicilian senator, Julius Firmicus Maternus, who was a famous astrologer before he became Christian, wrote a book during this period called On the Error of Profane Religions, arguing around the year 346 for the forceful extermination of all pagan worship. But in the years 353, 356, the imperial edict of 346 has to be renewed, a clear indication of its lack of complete success. The Christianization of the empire, in short, was an uphill battle. The final and prime evidence for this is the reign of the Emperor Julian, who was emperor for a very short period, 361 to 363. He is known unflatteringly by Christians as the apostate. He was raised Christian as part of the Constantinian dynasty, but he converted to paganism as an adult. And as emperor, he sought to restore the empire to its traditional polytheistic religion. Julian had been trained in rhetoric, indeed by the rhetorician Libanius, whom I mentioned earlier, and trained in philosophy. He was a student in Athens. And he was the author of some very impressive treatises on the philosophical way of life, treatises that are extant. He was lifted from his life as a student in Athens when Constantius II made him Caesar of the West in 355. Perhaps surprisingly, Julian proved to be a more than adept soldier. And in the year 360, when he was acclaimed Augustus by his troops, he felt himself in the position to openly renounce Christianity. When he became sole emperor in 361, he promoted a syncretistic form of religion. Jesus was to be honored, but not as divine. He was to be honored with other great men, Moses and Greek heroes, who manifested the divine. But there was nothing unique about Jesus in this respect, a thoroughly polytheistic perspective. And Julian reopened the pagan temples, bringing them back to their full functioning, the observance of the festivals, the carrying out of sacrifices. Furthermore, he removed Christians from high office, and he sought to return education to its pagan standards. To please the Jews, he began the project of restoring the temple in Jerusalem. But noteworthily, he did not persecute Christians in any active fashion. Now, it remains a fascinating historical question. What might have happened if Julian's reign had lasted for decades and he had not been cut down in battle as still a young man? It is quite imaginable that the Christian interlude begun by Constantine might have been only temporary, and Julian might have begun another long tradition of a Rome dedicated to polytheism. But it was not to be. Succeeding Christian emperors quickly and decisively restored Christian privileges after the death of Julian. But they continued to allow a certain freedom of worship, perhaps recognizing that Julian could not have been so successful in restoring pagan worship had there not been great popular support for it. But in contrast, the Emperor Gratian, who ruled from 375 to 383, rejected emperor worship, removed the altar of victory from the Roman Forum, discontinued any state subsidy for pagan worship, and went so far as to rob the temples. He confiscated temple funds. The decisive establishment of Christianity as the state religion of the empire, though, took place under Theodosius I, sometimes called Theodosius the Great, who ruled the East from 379 to 392, and was sole ruler of both East and West from 392 to 395. Theodosius issued an edict on the Catholic faith in 380, which imposed Christianity on all inhabitants of the empire. Here is the moment when coercion enters in. He closed all pagan temples, including that dedicated to Serapis, the Serapeum in Alexandria, and the most ancient temple of Apollo at Delphi. Many of these temples he seized for Christian worship, and in 391 he forbade any pagan worship. Climactically, in 392, Theodosius declared sacrifice to the gods to be high treason, punishable by death. In short, with Theodosius, Christianity had reached the same point that the pagan emperor Diocletian had reached a century earlier. Paganism was to be repressed by violence. Despite such repressive measures against paganism, however, Theodosius continued to maintain the right of Jews to assemble for worship. But in addition to not being allowed to proselytize, Jews could no longer even enter into mixed marriages with Christians. Again, it was hoped that Jews would die out of their own accord. This official sponsorship of Christianity was a decidedly mixed blessing for Christianity as a religion, considering it simply in religious terms. The positive benefits to individual Christians are obvious and very much on the surface. Security from danger, security from persecution are obvious goods. Being a Christian is no longer a crime, punishable by the state. Political advantage to Christians extends from the occupation of magnificent buildings to the possibility of ownership of land, to an edge, indeed, in bureaucratic advancement. Above all, the opportunity is open to expand the religion into a genuinely Christian culture. That is the theme we will follow in our next lecture. But the negative effects of establishment may be less obvious, but they are no less real. As self-designated Bishop of External Affairs, the emperor involved himself intimately and directly in religious matters. The calling of councils of bishops was as much a matter of political prudence as it was of religious concern. The overriding issue for these Christian emperors was exactly the same as it had been for the pagan emperors: the unity of the empire, the security of their rule. Religious divisiveness must be resolved at all costs in order to secure political stability. Thus, as early as 314, Constantine calls the Council of Arles, a city in southern Gaul, so that bishops can respond to the Donatist schismatics' appeal from their condemnation by the Bishop of Rome. Don't worry about the meaning of the word Donatist. I will discuss it in a later lecture. The council rejects the Donatists' petition and condemns that North African movement. In the year 325, Constantine not only summons the first ecumenical, that is, worldwide council at Nicaea in Asia Minor to decide the Arian controversy. Again, I'll talk about this later. He actually presides at the opening of the council and provides its agenda. Subsequent emperors would align themselves over the course of centuries with one party to a theological dispute or another, without having often the least real religious interest in the debate. And they would use the power of the state to enforce the position that they backed. Bishops, in turn, were all too willing to seek such imperial power in their support. As we will see, during the complex and seemingly endless Arian controversy of the 4th century, the Bishop of Alexandria, Athanasius, was repeatedly exiled and restored to his see according to the doctrinal allegiances of Constantine II and Constantius, neither of whom had any real conviction in the matter, but tried to put their weight behind what they saw as the most likely theological winner. Already in the 4th century, then, the lines of what would later be called Caesaropapism, the merging of imperial and religious power, were established. The challenge of being a state religion put severe internal stress on Christianity. Despite those impressive institutional and intellectual developments it had accomplished in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Christianity remained ill-prepared for the task of providing the glue for an entire society. It had started as a sect with a distinct countercultural disposition. It was eschatologically oriented. It saw the world as not permanent or even necessarily valuable. There is much in this religion that argues against stability and good order. Celibacy is better than marriage. Poverty is better than wealth. Humility is more important than arrogance. Obedience to God is to be preferred to obedience to humans. The canonical writings of Christianity are far from providing a consistent code of behavior. even for religious matters. The answer to the question, what does the New Testament teach on X or Y, is, what did you read last in the New Testament? It is not a collection of books that is able to provide a sharia, a system of law that can enable a civilization to organize itself. And as we saw earlier, in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, radical impulses in the name of Christianity continued to flourish, despite all the efforts of leaders to shape a centrist orthodoxy. Especially in the East, where imperial rule remained more stable, the precedents of pagan culture provided much of the form for this Christian empire. The basic elements of Greek paideia, remember that term means both culture and education, though now suffused with biblical content, remained consistent. The logic, the philosophy, the rhetoric, the plastic arts, all of these remained within the Christian empire very much as they had been in the pagan empire. And as the new imperial religion, Christianity was more and more recognizable as a Greco-Roman religion. It had now only vestigial connections to Judaism. The conversation with Jews had broken off completely. All Christian literature, including its Bible, was in Greek. Jews had turned decisively away from engagement with the Greek world and had moved progressively back toward Hebrew as the language of its religious observance. Christians, meanwhile, were reading their scripture in Greek and were interpreting their scripture through the rules of Greek rhetoric. The increased instability of the empire in the West, in contrast, would force Christianity both to engage new cultural realities, but also to forge a distinctively Christian culture as an instrument of civilization among barbarians. Positively, the West and the experience of Christianity in the West will evoke creativity rather than stagnation. But as a religion now in comfortable circumstances, how could Christianity continue to affirm the radical stance of its foundational compositions? This topic will occupy us in lecture number 16. But before we take up that question, we must look at the ways in which Christianity did fit itself to its new role in the extension of Christian culture. This will be the topic that we take up in our next presentation: the expansion of the Christian religion into a new cultural form for the Roman Empire.
Okay. Well, So, wow, there we go. Any questions, reacting to that? Yeah, Bob.
So he had mentioned early on about Constantine sort of creating these 50 copies.
Yeah.
Do any of those exist today?
Yeah, he said the Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. The Vaticanus, Codex Vaticanus is obviously in the Vatican Library. And it's one of those, this is really, really interesting. he's talking about, he does a really good job talking about how the Christian faith becomes a Greco-Roman faith, right? And he's saying, towards the end of the 4th century, the Bible had been translated into Greek, from the original Hebrew and the New Testament, and the thing of it was that didn't do people in the West any good at all because they spoke Latin. And so what happens is, around the year 400 or so, St. Jerome translates that into Latin, and so you've got what's called the Vulgate Latin Bible, which was translated around the year 400, and that becomes a standard Bible in the West down until around the year 1500. The problem with that is, he did a fairly good job, but the problem with that is, it has to be copied and recopied and recopied because they don't have printing presses, and you can imagine just how many errors and mistakes crept in, and sometimes there are mistranslations and things like that, so that by the time you get down to the 1500, the Vulgate Bible, both the Old as well as the New Testament, it needs a little cleaning up. And this is when they discovered the Vaticanus. It was actually in the Vatican Library. They said, whoa, look at this. This is one of the earliest Greek copies of the Bible that they had. And it's what Erasmus used to make his edition. And then Luther works from Erasmus's edition to make his German edition. So there's a direct link right there. So it's huge. It's huge. Yeah. You have to be... let me put it this way: nobody in this room, including me, is going to walk into the Vatican Library and say, "I'd like to see the Vaticanus, the Codex Vaticanus." You can't do that. You really have to be You have to be a well-known scholar, and you have to have really, really, really good reasons for looking at the Vaticanus. Yeah, because it's priceless. It's just absolutely priceless. Yeah, no.
This dates back to the 3rd century?
The 4th century, time of Constantine the Great, the 4th century. And there are 2 of them. There's this Sinaiticus, and I don't know if Erasmus had them. I'm sorry?
That he mentioned.
Yeah, both of them. Yeah, so that's huge. Okay, so here's a really good question for you, and that is, he does a great job talking about the role of these Roman emperors during from the time of Constantine, and he's focusing pretty much on the 4th century here in this particular lecture, talking about the role of these emperors in making Christianity then first allowing it to be tolerated and practiced openly, then starting to persecute people practicing the pagan religion, and then around the year 380 or so under Theodosian, it becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire. And the question you got to wrap your mind around is, why would these emperors even care? Why? What difference does it make to them what people are doing in their religious lives? And yet, it's very important, right? Because there are wars fought over this. Are we going to be pagan or are we going to be Christian? And one of the things that we have to get around is, in our own culture, religion tends to be a private matter. It's a very private matter, right? What you do, how you worship on Sunday, how you worship in your home, it's not any business of the state. It's a private matter. But this was not always the case. It wasn't the case in ancient Greece, and it wasn't the case in ancient Rome, and it wasn't the case down through the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance as well, primarily because people going all the way back to classical antiquity, and heck, even going back to the Greeks or to the Egyptians, firmly believed that the gods or God intervened on a regular basis in the affairs of men and in the affairs of state, right? And consequently, you had to show a great deal of reverence and obedience to these deities so as not to antagonize them, so you wouldn't bring their wrath down on you. Or, the flip side of that is, if you are worshiping and showing obedience and showing reverence towards a God, you can attract their favor towards you. This is how, in the ancient world, they explained why things happened the way they did, right? But it's not just random forces, it was the will of God. And this is what all of these emperors believe. And you have to, you have to think about this. Constantine, who's the first emperor to convert to Christianity, firmly believed he won that battle at Milvian Bridge because of this Christian God. This is huge. This is huge because it shows the power of God right off the bat, right? And all of these subsequent emperors were fixated on that. That Constantine had become sole emperor of the Roman Empire because this Christian God had intervened. And then, they begin to make their own sacrifices to God. They begin to worship God. The victories begin to pile up, and it's just reinforcing. It's reinforcing itself. And you can see why, at a certain point, they want to declare Christianity to be the official religion. But as he points out, that's not an easy thing to do, because you have millions and millions and millions and millions of people out there still pagan, right? And it's going to be a long, tough slog in order to convert these people to Christianity. Any other questions about any of this? No. I have a couple of other things. Let me see here. I was taking notes, of course. Let me see. The other thing that he points out, which is really important here, is he uses the term Caesaropapism. And that is, whereas let's focus on what he's talking about. The notion of Caesaropapism is that because of the enormous importance of religion, and that is that, if you placate these God, the proper God, and you worship the proper God, then he will shower you with blessings and with victories and with wealth. These emperors, beginning with Constantine the Great, felt that they should have a direct hand in the guidance and the administration of this religion, and also determining theology. And he talks about the Council of Nicaea. This is the first great ecumenical council that's held under the auspices of the Christians in the year 325. It's convened, Constantine the Great has been he's been a Christian now. He converts in 313, and about 13 years later, he convenes this great ecumenical council in the city of Nicaea in Turkey. And you get all of these bishops and all of these theologians and these sorts of people showing up there. And Constantine says, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to do this, this, and this. And he's trying to, there's this debate over what is the true nature of Christ. This is something that, we don't seem to wrap our minds around or struggle with too much. But for these people, it was really a problem, because the question was, how could a divine being take on a human body? How could a divine being take on a human body? And if that divine being did take on a human body, then how much of that person, that individual, was divine and how much was man? How much was divine and how much was man? And if in fact that divine creature could take on a human body, it couldn't be fully God, because God cannot take on a corporeal body. Right? This is the Arian position that Jesus, all right, granted, Jesus is in fact divine, but he can't be on the same level as God the Father, because pure deity cannot take on human flesh. Right? And this was a huge, he mentions Athanasius, right, the bishop of Alexandria, and it's Athanasius who sort of lays out all of this theology, and it really resonates with people. They're willing to believe that Jesus is the Son of God, but he's not co-equal with God, right? He's the Son of God, but he's not co-equal with God. He takes on human flesh, and pure divinity can't do this sort of thing, but he's still part of God, and you can believe in him as a Son of God and as a Redemptor, but he's not equal to God. And this starts to spread throughout the entire Eastern world, and then you get all of these other theologians who say, no, this is not right. That Christ is in fact co-equal with God. He is begotten, right? He is not born secondary, but he just literally is part of, begotten out of God. He's equal. And there's a huge fight going on. And Constantine says, come to Nicaea and we're going to figure this out. Come to Nicaea and we're going to figure this out. And he's the one that presides over this council. And this sets the precedent for these emperors thereafter to call these councils anytime there's this, a discrepancy over theology, and to hammer these things out. Okay, so you can see when Christianity then becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire, how it immediately, the imperial power gets its claws into it and is not going to let it go, and really begins to shape it. You just wonder what Jesus would have said about all of this. He does a really good job there towards the end saying, if you look at it, Christianity in its origins, it was on the margins, right? It was out there on the margins. It was on the outside looking in. It was counterculture. And Jesus, he preached a message of poverty and humility, and he preached a message of nonviolence, you know. And then all of a sudden, all of that, which is intrinsic to Christianity, is being challenged by the fact that now it's the state religion, right? And there's just tension. One of the results of this is monasticism, right? This is where monasticism comes in. There are no monks in the 1st or 2nd or 3rd centuries. It's only after Christianity becomes the state religion where you get a number of people saying, no, this is not what Christianity is all about. If you're going to be a Christian, you need to get back to the Gospels. You need to separate yourself. You need to go out into the wilderness, get a couple of companions, and live together and practice poverty and chastity and obedience, right? So that's one of the great outcomes of this embracing of the religion by the state, and you get the development of monasticism and monastic orders. Okay, we got time maybe for 1 or 2 more questions. Does that jog any? Yes. No, that's it. Everybody good? Yeah, please. I heard.
I don't know how long that continued, the idea of being baptized, a few minutes before you die.
Yeah.
So that you wouldn't sin anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting because, of course, by the later Middle Ages, the church is practicing infant baptism, and the Lutherans still practice infant baptism, right? And one of the reasons for this is that it becomes as much a washing away of sins, it becomes almost a talisman to protect that newborn infant from the devil in case. And it almost, this notion of infant baptism develops along with the idea of purgatory, whereas if a child dies before it has been brought into the church and its sins are forgiven, then it is going to go to purgatory with the odds of it probably never getting out. It's just going to be tortured and tortured and tortured. And so the idea is, let's baptize the child early on. This is going to do away with the sins that are imputed to the child from the original sin at the time of birth, and it is going to, if that child does die while still a baby, then it will have a chance to be relieved from purgatory and go into heaven. So that develops, you see that developing in the later Middle Ages along with the idea of purgatory, infant baptism. Yeah. But in the early church, yeah, you see quite clearly it's practiced, it's adult baptism. Yeah. Fascinating. Our religion has an absolutely amazing history behind it. We just look at all these things as being, oh, this is the way it's always been, and that's just simply not true. The things that we think are hallowed and, our fathers' religion, there's a history there. Okay, well, unfortunately, this is the last of the videos for this series, but he does a really good job, and I really like what he does. So we'll schedule more of these for probably the fall or maybe next winter again. Next week, we have, I want to tell you what's happening next week, Darkness and Depression and Leaning on Faith. Boy, that's a really timely class for this time of year. Led by Barbara Debner and Linda Van Gelder, and that's going to be in Piper Hall. And then here, we're going to listen to Pastor Vicky and her Uganda mission team talk about what they did when they were in Uganda. So try to make one of those 2 next week, all right? And thanks for coming.